Well, if Mexico thought the US wasn't going to manifest its destiny all over them during this period, well, they were wrong. That's right, it's time to talk about the Mexican-American War. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so as I talked about in the last video, this time period in US history is positively dominated by US westward expansion, thanks in large part to the hypnotic spell cast by the manifest destiny ideology. And so early in the period, the pangs in the American belly to expand west are going to cause the Mexican-American War. So let's talk about how that happened. Now, James K. Polk became president in 1844, and his central campaign issue was U.S. expansionism. To that end, Polk aimed to use his presidency to accomplish three things: annex Texas, which the U.S. had been trying to do since the 1820s on account of it was a fine place to expand the cotton cultivation that was fueling American industrialization. Also, Polk aimed to settle the dispute with Great Britain over Oregon and purchase California from Mexico. So in order to acquire California, Polk sent a delegate to the Mexican government with authorization to purchase the territory for $15 million, but the Mexican officials went ahead and shut that delegation all the way down. And to quote the Mexican government in Spanish, they said no, which when being translated into English roughly means no. But why would the Mexican government turn down a $15 million bag to keep California when it wasn't all that populated to begin with? Well, that's because the Mexicans were still pretty saucy about Texas. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all of my videos, check the link in the description. Now, recall that Texas was formerly Mexican territory, and the Mexican government had invited American migrants to settle there and make a life under Mexican authority, not least because they hoped that those Americans would create a buffer against powerful indigenous groups like the Comanche who had been giving them trouble for years. But long story short, Americans living in Texas launched a revolution against Mexico and became an independent republic in 1836. And for 10 years, that is how Texas remained, not a part of Mexico and not a part of the United States. And the reason the US didn't go ahead and annex Texas is because such an act would for sure start a war with Mexico, because the Mexican government still claimed ownership over the rebellious Northern Territory. And perhaps even more important, Whigs and other abolitionists got whipped up into a proper fury over the prospect of adding another slave state to the Union. But James K. Polk won the presidency on the promise that he would annex Texas, and so in 1845, that's exactly what Congress did. And to Polk's great disappointment, the war just wasn't getting started soon enough, so he decided to manufacture a start to the conflict. Now, of special importance was the dispute over the western border of Texas. Texans claimed it was the Rio Grande, while Mexicans claimed it was the Nueces River. Therefore, upon being snubbed regarding the purchase of California, Polk sent American troops led by General Zachary Taylor across the Nueces River, and Mexico sent troops across the Rio Grande to meet them. And so fighting erupted in 1846, and Polk used that opportunity to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. And his justification was that American blood had been spilled on American soil. To be absolutely clear, that patch of land was highly disputed, and it was no way clearly American soil. But that didn't matter much to Congress, who, after drinking deeply from the cup of manifest destiny, granted a declaration of war. However, I should mention that this declaration was granted over the loud protest of anti-war Whigs who denounced the war. And one of those sassy Whigs was Abraham Lincoln, who demanded to know the exact spot on which American blood was spilled, which became known as his spot resolution. But as I said, the anti-war contingent got shut all the way down and the war was on. Now, you really don't need to know how the war was fought or any of the campaigns or whatever. What you really need to know are the effects of the war, so let's talk about it. Okay, so the Mexican-American War ended in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had three major effects that you're gonna need to tuck away in your brain folds. First, the Mexican cession granted the U.S. over half of Mexico's territory, which was the largest land acquisition in U.S. history, second only to the Louisiana Purchase. So the treaty granted the U.S. the disputed territory in Texas and established the border at the Rio Grande. Additionally, the U.S. gained the New Mexico territory and California in exchange for $15 million. And remember, that was the price that Polk offered Mexico for California alone, and now it's all of this. So from the perspective of manifest destiny, the Mexican-American War was a massive success, since the Grand American Empire was now rubbing shoulders with both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Okay, the second big effect of gaining all this western land was a bitter dispute over the expansion of slavery. So even before the war was over, this congressional battle erupted with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. So what happened is that Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot added a rider to a funding bill that mandated slavery be banned in all land gained from the war with Mexico. And even though it was voted down, this move felt like a proper smack in the face to Southern representatives who wanted those lands to expand slavery in order to protect their own interests in the government. Now, these slavery-loving Southern Democrats had a range of reactions to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Some opposed it because they felt like it didn't go far enough. Like, since the expansion of slavery was vital to their survival and the securing of political power, why not take all of Mexico and expand the institution as far south as they could? But others others, like John C. Calhoun, struggled with the racial implications of the Mexican cession. Now, for sure, he was a slave power man through and wanted the institution to spread as far and wide as possible. However, he worried about the Mexicans and American Indians who already populated those lands that would be gained in the victory. And I don't mean he worried about them and their safety or any nonsense like that. No, Calhoun believed the United States to be the domain of white men, and therefore he could not abide the thought of offering citizenship to the many Mexicans who lived in those lands. Anyway, the point is, from the perspective of American power and manifest destiny, the lands gained in the Mexican cession were all blessing, full stop. But from the perspective of the expansion of slavery, the battle is soon going to become so bitter and divisive that the slaveholding states would decide to leave the Union and form their own country where slavery would not be messed with. And then the third big effect of the war was conflict with Mexicans and American Indians. Now, despite the abundant rhetoric that described the Western territories as open and unpopulated, the lands of the Mexican cession were very much populated. And once the territory changed hands from Mexico to the United States, conflicts erupted quick, fast, and in a hurry. As for American Indians, by far the most persistent threat was the Comanche Nation. They had been harassing settlers in Texas and northern Mexico even before the territory changed hands to the United States. In fact, since the Comanche regularly attacked and raided Mexican settlements in the north and undermined their economy, U.S. expansionists argued that taking the land and taming the Comanche was in fact a noble and charitable act on behalf of the Mexicans living there. But once the territory belonged to the U.S., American troops fought a series of conflicts with the Comanche and Kiowa that lasted until the 1870s, when the indigenous groups had finally been conquered by American military power, as well as ravaging diseases they acquired from westward migrating Americans. But Americans also had conflicts with Mexicans, who now lived under the authority of the United States. Now, during the Texas Revolution, white American settlers known as Anglos fought alongside Mexican natives known as Tejanos. However, after independence was achieved and Texas became the 28th state to join the United States, the relationship between the two groups grew tense. First of all, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stated that all former Mexican citizens in the Mexican cession would become U.S. citizens. However, states were able to make their own citizenship laws, and in no time they banned everyone except white Mexican men from citizenship. Second of all, Anglos, always hungry for new soil, expelled many Tejanos from their land and made further efforts to marginalize their standing in Texas society. For example, Texans pressured Tejanos to assimilate to white American culture, and some did submit by sending their children to American schools and attempting to convert them to Protestantism. And for the most part, such efforts failed, and Tejanos were largely reduced to unskilled agricultural laborers as Anglos took dominion over their new state. However, at least one Tejano resisted such policies with violence, namely Juan Cortina. Now, he was a wealthy Mexican landowner who held territory on both sides of the Rio Grande. And when Texans began claiming land on the American side of the border for themselves, it launched a series of conflicts known as the Cortina Wars, aimed at resisting American expansion. And U.S. forces, along with the Texas Rangers, eventually defeated Cortina and confined him to the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. However, from there, Cortina continued to launch intermittent raids against southern Texas over the course of several decades. So all in all, the Mexican-American War increased U.S. military prestige while at the same time reigniting debates over the expansion of slavery, and those debates are only going to get more fiery over the next few videos. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos from Unit 5, or you can click here to get my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.